Somewhere, I guess in Shaking the Pumpkin, does this thing work? Okay. I think it was in Shaking the Pumpkin, I said something about teaching poetry classes with a rattle and a drum, a rattle or a drum. I said that a little prematurely because I wasn't using a rattle then. But shortly thereafter, in order to get across in a fairly immediate way things that were that I had seen happening in Seneca poetry, I began to sing some of the songs in English translation. And it's become for me also, in the process of singing them, learning much more about them and finding that they had a way of, calming me, exhausting and calming me, a simultaneous process. So before getting into that part of the session, which is, I suppose, largely going to be talking and reading, and on the notion that poetry, although I'm devoted to books, that poetry doesn't need that poetry precedes writing, precedes a literate tradition, that poetry goes back to our earliest beginnings as human beings and continues in some kind of unbroken line up to the present, in which writing is, I would take as both a complication and another possibility. So I'm going to sing a few songs, and then maybe others would want to come into that. I usually do it by myself, but there's no reason for that. These songs, the originals where these songs come from, would be sung by a single ceremonial leader in a ceremony called Shaking the Pumpkin for medicine society, sometimes called, I suppose, by 19th century anthropologists who were first charting that thing, the Society of the Mystic Animals, which is a lovely name. Or in Seneca, eidos, the word eidos, which is untranslatable as anything else but the name of that society, that medicine society, and that ceremony. So the mystic animals, the animals of the ceremony, are called into the sacred precinct at the beginning, and if translated, goes something like this. The animals are coming The animals are coming The animals are coming. The animals are coming. The animals are coming. Shilun, too soon. Shilun, too soon. Too soon. Too soon. Soon to soon to soon to soon to Caw-caw, the crow comes at us. 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 Caw-caw, the crow who's here. 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 cockcrow who's here. Sometimes I don't know if that leaves me in a better position to talk or not. I keep thinking that it does. The situation, of course, is in many ways seems to be totally transformed from the way in which that song, those poems, would be delivered. Back there is it's the northeast, in what's still a woodlands area, along the southern tier in New York, that New York-Pennsylvania border, at the Allegheny Seneca reservation, place that the Senecas in fact began to settle. The Indians. The Eastern Indians were sending out, in effect, pioneer groups. Saying that movement of Europeans was also, of course, causing other kinds of movements. And this area along the Allegheny River was a Seneca pioneer settlement. It wasn't the ordinary place. I mean, they might have gone into there for hunting reasons, but that was, the settlement was further east in the Geneseo area, largely, they settled there under the influence of the great chief corn planter. And that's become the place, a thin, narrow strip along the Allegheny River, a mile wide on each side and extending, I think, for 41 or 42 miles. But there's still animals in the vicinity. And some of the people, at least, still trace the lineage, heritage from animal ancestors through an ongoing clan system, but maybe more about that later. When I first started writing, specifically writing poetry, I wouldn't have imagined myself in a situation of shaking a rattle and singing songs. I mean, one knew from early along a connection between poetry and song. And I think the ongoing idea then was that poetry becomes poetry when it separates itself from song. Not part of, that it wasn't poetry as long as part of a more complicated and unified system, but it becomes poetry as somehow the voice moves away from the actual singing. Yet poets, even at that time, were talking about their music. And David Antin, who's been a close friend for 20 years, then found that terminology incomprehensible, and still finds it. What kind of music are you, talking about once that separation has been made? So Antin, in one of the interesting reconsiderations of poetry and where it all comes from, says, no, not from song, from discourse, from speech. That as another possibility. What I'm going to be talking about some of the work that I've done, which is not completely my own work. I mean, that is the work of these various anthologies that begin to make a big pile of whatever, and in a little while, an even bigger pile. I'm assuming that that some of you know one of these or two of these, but I'll go through a kind of run through of what the intention was there and how I think it ties in, very much ties into the work of other contemporaries. So in that sense, not a personal work at all, though in other ways, very personal and increasingly personal. But when I say Antin raises the possibility that poetry derives not from song, as some of us came later to believe. But from discourse, I put that in a context of contemporary poetry as being involved in the raising of possibilities about itself, raising of possibilities about poetry itself, and therefore laying itself open, to the greater possibility of transformation and self-transformation, both for poetry, that great conglomerate body, and presumably for the individuals involved in the process, both as speakers, sounders, listeners. Though it seems to me that one development that people are a little uncomfortable about, but it seems to be taking place, is a convergence of the poet and the audience for poetry. Philip Whalen quoting Walt Whitman in that slogan that used to be on the, or maybe still is, on the back of Poetry magazine, which I haven't seen in years. In order to have great poets or great poetry, you have to have great audiences. Now, then there is a possibility that ultimately what you move towards, why are there so many poets? Well, it must be, that poetry is developing into a condition in which there will be no separation between poetry and audience. So maybe that's not a terrible thing when you say, well, I go around and give poetry readings, and it seems to be full of the audience is full of young poets or of people who do poetry, make their own poetry. And one said, where are the other people? Well, maybe that's not that kind of cause for alarm. I mean, surely we can't all be becoming poets, because the profession is so, terrific and pays off so well that, why does the directory that Writers and Poets puts out, it's just a small sampling of people seriously doing poetry in America, and yet I've never counted it up, but a huge gathering of names there. More individuals truly than the market can bear, if it's a question of market in any sense. So it seems something else must be going on, and maybe that coming together of that I am both a poet and an audience for poetry. Maybe ultimately that if it continues to proliferate, so in a paraphrase. From I think it's Isaiah. No. It's from one of the first 5 books of the of the Old Testament. The paraphrase that seems to be implicit in William Blake's use of it. Would that all the children of the Lord, would that all God's children were poets. Or he said, would that all God's children were prophets. But one of the interesting possibilities that's raised, by Blake, primarily, and then again and again, up to the present, is a convergence, an identification of poetry and prophecy. So Blake, looking back, recognizes the prophets not only as prophets, which is a historical situation in itself, but sees them as men of open and expansive senses that he can identify with that concept of the poet that he's developing. And Blake himself, in the sense of the word prophetic, meaning being able to look into the future, which is perhaps a very minor notion of what prophecy is about, but still I think we tend to think of it in those terms. He's being prophetic in that sense towards. Again, one of the possibilities being explored today and throughout this century, and back throughout the last century, and maybe something even hidden beneath the facade of poetry as a literary enterprise, which has also been dominant in cultures that can be literary, that can deal with letters and with writing. So I'll again and again use the term possibility, possibilities, opening possibilities, and opening, rather than closing, not closing the possibilities, not coming down to a single answer. But that more and more I feel the involvement for me with poetics, poesis, as a process is because of all processes that I know for that kind of exploration of mind or whatever that people talk about. The poetic engagement, the poetic process seems most to allow when it's really working, most to allow for an absolute contradiction. The poetic liberty, the poetic license, which was hammered into our heads even as kids, though in a kind of derogatory way. Well, he says that's a lie. That's his poetic license. So in a sense, the poet has had, in many ages, even though we're hostile to poetry, this license, this privilege to create what the preservers of the established reality, would take as the lie. The poet can make lies, and for this, Plato banished, or would have banished, the poets from the Republic, because at least at that point, he chose to be obtuse to what was going on. Though elsewhere, or maybe in the same context, he says, but I was once too, in love with poetry. I was once a poet myself. So he's a little bit like Laura Riding in that sense, or Laura Riding is a little bit like Plato in that sense when she says, that she renounces poetry, gives that up because the poet is ultimately a teller of lies, and she says he's a teller of lies because he does what poets so often do, pursues the truth by other means. Those means very often, let's say, a pursuit of the truth through soundings. In other words, to let sound lead you. When sound leads you, maybe you get to the same place, maybe you get to another place. But if you're following that development through Plato, Aristotle, and the makers of European logic and rationalism, it's a false pursuit. And yet most poets I know, what determines the next word? Well, in some sense, the sound determines the next word. What is it for the sound to determine? Is that sound for the sound to determine the next word? Okay, those are possibilities. But remember, Plato and Laura Riding say poetry, no, not poetry, a lying word, poet, a lying word. I'm haunted by technology. Technology at a certain point became one of the other possibilities, but it's very dangerous. I've told the story a number of times, giving a poetry, we were having something we called an ethnopoetics conference out at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, where I was teaching temporarily. And I got into this rap about technology, and I said there's a danger in all of this, and I told the story of being somewhere or another giving a poetry reading at night, and the lights went out. Right, there was a power failure, and when that power goes, if you got to pick this book up and read those words, you can only do it in daylight. There are no nighttime ceremonies at that point. You have to be able to see it, and if you're doing it at night, you have to depend on this system. And this system is, I don't know how it works, but it's hooked into that wall and goes off, wherever the power comes from here. But it's very far away. So I was giving the poetry reading, and the lights did go out. What do I do? So I grabbed my trusty rattle. So I couldn't have done that some time ago, and and began doing what I could do without that extra power source. So I told this story at Milwaukee, right? And a little bit later, I guess that same morning, Nathaniel Tarn got up to deliver a written talk. Well, it wouldn't have mattered written or not. The power went out, and it was a big room with no windows. It was dark, no microphones. It was too large for him to continue talking. So as if the thing was planned, the same event repeated itself. So I think for emergency purposes, as my wife remembering the death march in Bataan, and people being carried off to concentration camps and so forth during the Second World War. Says she wants to be able to, to walk at great distances, not for the love of walking, just as a precautionary measure, if it ever comes to that. Okay, in America, a prophecy. We're occasionally also dependent on other instruments of a perhaps simpler technology, but oh yes. The opening of possibilities. I began to write poetry in order to write poetry, and I was reading poetry simultaneously. And it was an enterprise, it felt to me, very much in the present. And it still feels to me like an enterprise very much in the present. But we do carry a sense of the past with us. And as I found, the more I would get into, quote, experimental situations with poetry, the more it began to transform my notion of poetry in all times and places. Now, the big opening up for myself, for people of my generation, is sometime in the 1950s, and it's. I'll be talking about this later. It's at least a second opening up in American poetry. The first one coming shortly before the First World War, lasting through the 20s and 30s, and seeming to close up in the 40s and part of the 50s. And then, that allowed another outburst, another revolution, another break with seemingly another past, with another series of conventions that had built up. And when it happened, the people like me, it was kind of overwhelming. Suddenly poetry, was appearing, which, it kind of resembled things that we had seen in, if there were old copies of magazines like Transition or the one available book on Dada at that point by Robert Motherwell. It looked a little bit like that, and it was a little bit like that, and in fact it came out of a straight line from that earlier experimentation. But it kind of changed. It changed, certainly the whole notion of what a poem looks like. So that you could get faked out. You could, open a book. Some of the found poetry, Byrne Porter, is like this. You open a book and you see things now, that look like poems. They're laundry lists, whatever. But in some way they become poems too. Particularly, let's say, as a really good found poet like Byrne Porter utilizes them. So by the time I get around with George Quasha to making America a prophecy, we can get in a whole statement about how this works, and as a kind of opener, though it's out of chronological order. I'll read the part of that statement that seems particularly to pertain to this. Every important change in poetry opens the way for new work in the future and for a redefinition of the past. And of course, it's very hard writing things together, but we're very careful in that. Opens the way for new work in the future. Put that first, right? So that there's we're not engaged here simply in an antiquarian enterprise. So opens the way for new work in the future and for a redefinition of the past. The 1855 Leaves of Grass, for example, is a declaration of independence from the bondage, that's Whitman's word, from the bondage of British and European conventions. No, it's not Whitman's word. Got to think of it, it's Milton's word. From the Okay, the 1855 Leaves of Grass, for example, is a declaration of independence from the bondage of British and European conventions that both heralds the 1950s, Charles Olson's projective verse or Allen Ginsberg's howl, and frees us to see and express the structural possibilities of archaic and tribal poetries at a similar remove from those conventions. Okay, so two things happen. One, well, Whitman was aware of it. I mean, this is avant-garde, if that term hasn't been too much debased. Well, Whitman is aware of himself as the beginning of something, and he's constantly proclaiming that. He knows there will be new bards after him. He seems fairly confident of that. This is only a beginning. So in that way, it looks into the future. It already sets models for things that are going to be happening in the future, and also models to disrupt and fight against, even as say somebody like Pound fights against Whitman. But it also turns back to other possibilities. The equalizing, people who like to rank things. It takes a phenomenon like Hebrew poetry, the poetry of the Old Testament, and gives it an equal status with poetry out of the Greek tradition. And I wouldn't talk even when I raise up the picture, say, of American Indian poetry or tribal poetry. It's not a question of trying to set up new hierarchies. This is better than that. This is more important than that. It's not a question of setting up judgments in that sense, but in a condition where things have been narrowed down to a single tradition, or worse, single convention, to set out this number of equalities and possibilities. So all these developments share the sense of poetry as an act of vision, charged with the immediate energies of authentic speech and shaped by its moment in history. Any truly new work, and then we give examples, because we thought we should give examples. Any truly new work, such as that of Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein, William Carlos Williams, Louis Zukowski, or John Cage, is an invitation to read, think, and speak differently. It permits a reader or hearer to experience, as nothing else quite does, new levels of consciousness and verbal meaning. After the surrealist experiments with dream states and automatic writing, we are more attentive to what used to be called the irrational. Similarly, the efforts of Dada poets of the 1920s to make use of pure sound, a lot of these words are in quotation marks. I don't want to keep going through that gesture. Similarly, the efforts of Dada poets of the 1920s to make use of pure sound link up in our minds with the wordless poetries of pre-literate societies, once thought meaningless, the meditative chants of the East, and certain ritual, magical, and mystical texts of the West. So too, the partly or wholly visual devices of concrete poetry have reminded us that the separation of the verbal and the pictorial is comparatively recent. It did not exist for the Egyptians, Mayans, and medieval Europeans, or for William Blake. In many such ways, some subtle, some extreme, the domain of poetry has been extended to include virtually any use of language. That's a glowing possibility. Okay, and with that, the good slogan of Pound's, "Make it new," which is a translation, more or less, I guess, from Chinese and Confucius. The Pound, the context outside of the collection, "Make It New," in one of the cantos, if you remember, Ching prayed on the mountain and wrote, "Make it new," big caps, "make it new," on his bathtub. Day by day, make it new. Cut underbrush, pile the logs, keep it growing. It's as it appears in Canto 53.